1760 to 1780.
So for 20.
So for 20 years,
So through the revolution.
people got here, they fought with the revolution, they were safe, they built farms, and suddenly they're told in their adult life, But I'm a woman. I have 2 kids here, right? One was born in December and one was born in January. And one can be freed upon her 28th birthday, and the other will never be free.
Unless they go north.
Unless they go north,
Further north.
unless they seek freedom, unless they find an agent, and that agent finds them the next person in the equation, which is called a conductor. Now, conductors knew everything about a little piece of earth and didn't want to know anything else about the rest of it. Because yes, ma'am. Because a conductor was supposed to conduct you from the agent to a safe house. And I know how to get people from here to there, but I don't want to know anything else.
Got it.
Because I don't know, So Harriet Tubman is a conductor. Sojourner Truth is a conductor. But there were many men and women who knew how to move along the Appalachian Trail, the Natchez Trace, the Mountain Ridge, and how to conduct you on foot from the agent starting point, your leap to your first resting place, and then they turn back. There was also transporters. Not all freedom seekers were going on foot. There were transporters like Mr. William Goodrich of York, Pennsylvania, who you'll hear in Barbara's presentation. Mr. Goodrich owned rail cars for lumber. He was a friend of Mr. William Whipper in Columbia on the Susquehanna River, and his partner, Stephen Smith, who was in Philadelphia. And so they would conduct freedom seekers in false bottom rail cars filled with lumber, and Mr. Goodrich would get them from York to Lancaster, and Mr. Whipple would get them across the river to Belmont Mansion, and Mr. Smith would get them from Belmont Mansion into William Steele's in Philadelphia, who would conduct them on to New York and up the Hudson. So it was passing. Those men had codes, 2 bushels of berries and a peck of peaches coming, well, berries were children and peaches were women, and all of these, and they would send codes, of shipping codes to each other. The conductors were on the ground, on the foot. I mean, there's nothing that I could say to lift the conductors up. They were the ones who were going through the woods in the middle of the night with hounds. The transporters were people like John and James Vachon in Pittsburgh, who were wig makers, and they would refashion you. They put on a wig and a beard and dress you up. There's 2 very famous stories about a white woman and the black gentleman. The white woman dressed as a man and the black gentleman dressed as her butler, and they escaped from George Vachon completely made up. Our own dear Frederick Douglass, he escaped in plain sight. He dressed as a stevedore. and loaded coal onto a boat and went his wife made him a stevedores costume. He got in amongst the workers. So there were many ways that you kind of conducted to the freedom. You went to a safe house. And hello.
Hi, Lenwood, how are you?
I can't complain. Good to see you. Come on in. Let's get-
Hey, Barb.
It's
Hi.
vamping till ready here, you know. Yeah. You went to a safe house, and the safe house was a very temporary place. Not everything had to do with a tunnel. Not everything had to do. Sometimes you traveled because the creek was dry. Sometimes you traveled because the creek had ice on it and you could cross on ice. That was the conductor's job to know when was the best time to move you to the safe house. From the safe house, you met another conductor onto your journey, and you got to what is called a free town. A free town was where you could rest for a season, for a winter, you know, until spring. You could get your weight back. You could eat. You know, you could revive. You knew you were not over Jordan. You had not arrived at your site, but you were free from the risk of surveillance. Only bounty hunters loved free towns, and bounty hunters hired people in the free towns and turned folks in. So free wasn't free till you got to where where you were safe, you know. And your goal was to get to a free town, build. I'm going to end there because our speaker is here, but back to gradual abolition for a moment. The life expectancy at the passage of the Gradual Abolition Act of a white male immigrant, might as well say Irish or German, you know, was 31. The life expectancy of a white immigrant woman was 18. The life 18, you know, childbirth,
I was gonna say.
Plagues, work, you know, passage, you know. The life expectancy of an African American male at the time was 14.
Wow.
And the life expectancy of African American woman was 36. So on the edges of society, you had a lot of white men and a lot of black women, you know, who were surviving the catastrophe of enslavement and bondage, you know, and they amalgamated. So all of the mythology about rape and the plantation, that not everybody came out. Amalgamation was an assumption of endurance before the Civil War. After the Civil War, the term amalgamation was replaced by a legal term called miscegenation, where it was illegal to intermarry, instead of the act of survival. So 1780, by 1818, you know, if you lived, you graduated. But we passed two more laws before you got there, and this is where I'll stop. One was passed in 1790 that said that if you are freed, you must leave the state that you were freed in within 30 days.
Okay.
Because they didn't know what to do with it.
Right? I don't know what to do with a free man. But you have to leave your family. You have to, the consequences of your freedom is that you have to leave.
Just the men,
And any free person.
so that they took their families with them.
Yeah. But you had all these things going on, because Betty's born before gradual abolition and Sally's born after, and we also passed in 1792 the 3/5 Act, which says that each black person is 3/5 of a person for taxes and for voting. It's how we gain our electoral college. So freedom costs you something. Freedom was risky business. It was separation, and this rolling risk taking is overlap on this system of deliverance, to freedom, which we call the Underground Railroad, with the discussion at the same time of what do we do with people when they get to wherever they're going, and how do we manage them. The 3/5 Act of 1792.
I'm sorry.
Two more very quick things, and you've been kind. I've just been kind of covering. Two more things that we should think about in this complex story. One is 1808, when we try to do the right thing, we passed the end of the Atlantic slave trade. We stopped importing enslaved people into the Caribbean, which was like the reception center. You can think of it as Ellis Island, where people are acclimated before they're moved into the states of the Louisiana Purchase, which are the 11 states up the middle. But in 1808, they passed the end of the Atlantic slave trade, but they revitalized an old law, which is called Partus Sequitur Ventum. It means from the mother's womb. Any child born from the mother's womb takes on the condition of the mother. So we start breeding enslaved people in America. We stop importing them, but we start breeding them in Philadelphia, in Baltimore, and these are the people who are trying to make it into this system that Barbara talked about and along to wherever their Jordan is, with the consequences along the way of each person breaking the law by helping someone to achieve their self-emancipation. It's on that background that we can weave Barb's story about this, the getaway system.
Getaway system.
Yeah.
Do we have a screen?
I don't know. I think it might just be the wall.
Great, it's black. I have my slideshow.
I'm not working here. I just brought
You need to
my.
have ready.
A screen, just a screen. I'm gonna do this. I'm hoping that as we go through this presentation, you'll have a better understanding of how the Underground Railroad functioned using the mainline canal. So let's go through this. The first thing we're going to start with, again, I'm sorry, it's not a black background.
Sorry about that.
Underground Railroad. So as Lenwood just gave you a very good understanding of the Underground Railroad, Pennsylvania is critical, much like the state of Ohio was, because it was a border state. We bordered Virginia just as Ohio bordered Kentucky. And when Lenwood was talking about what do you do with free people, if you read any of the excerpts from Cincinnati, which was literally right across the bridge from Kentucky, while there were a lot of abolitionists in Ohio, and they were, they did everything they could for freedom seekers when they came over the border, once they got in Ohio, they didn't know what to do with them. They didn't have work. They were kind of, they put them in neighborhoods. It became a problem. It became a social problem of what to do with all these people who were seeking freedom in Ohio. Pennsylvania, being a much longer state, had different travels. You'll see here on the map kind of where this map is showing people coming up from Virginia toward eastern Pennsylvania, although you're going to find today there was a lot of activity here in western Pennsylvania as well. So why the main line of public works? So this is an interesting story from the state. Before 1834, you traveled across the state of Pennsylvania by wagon. If you've noticed on Route 30, for instance, which was a well-worn traverse across the state, there are towns about every 12 miles. Do you know why that is?
Not a clue. I was.
Because that's how far a horse could walk in a day.
Or needed to eat.
12 miles was the extent of horse-drawn transportation back in the day. And there were two types of taverns if you look along the way. If you were at the bottom of a mountain and there was a lot of land around, you were a drover's tavern. Drovers were the people moving livestock. So those taverns would have pens, they would have open fields. That's where drovers would stop and stay. Taverns that tended to be at the top of mountains were for travelers, people who were actually traveling back and forth. They tended to be nicer taverns. They tended to be more lavish inside than the drovers' taverns. But along Route 30, there's a town just about every 12 miles. The problem by this time, though, is we need to get more commerce to the west faster. And Pennsylvania discovered in the 1830s it was losing out big time. And it was losing out to the Erie Canal to the north and the Baltimore and Ohio Canal to the south. So the legislature said, we've got to do something. We're losing commerce, we're losing travelers, we're losing all of this because it takes 12 days to go from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh. 12 days by horse and wagon to cross the state. Too long. It's taken too long, right? The Erie Canal and the B&O are doing it much faster. So they decide they're going to put in the main line of public works. Now, the only problem with that is, and again, this is, you can't see this, but Pennsylvania geography. Let's talk about the geography for a minute. So you've got all this nice land over here, all this nice land over here, and these pesky Allegheny Mountains that come right up through the middle. To get across this state in something other than a horse and wagon is going to prove a challenge. But this geography also dictates a lot of how the routes of Underground Railroad activity occurred as well. So when you look at Underground Railroad activity, oftentimes it follows the geography. So you have a lot of activity on this side of the Allegheny Ridge, and you have a lot of activity on this side of the Allegheny Ridge. There were also, we're going to find out later, there were also a lot of Indian trails that traveled north and south this way as well. Freedom seekers tended to use those as well to seek freedom. But the geography for the mainline canal is going to be really troublesome. How are we getting over those mountains? Here's what they come up with. They decide they're going to use a series of 4 different modes of transportation, well, actually really just 3 modes of transportation, to get us across the state. We're going to start in Philadelphia, and from Philadelphia to Columbia and Lancaster County, we're going to use a traditional railroad, the Philadelphia and Columbia Rail Line. In Columbia, they're going to put you on a canal boat, and they're going to take you up the Susquehanna to the Juniata, from the Juniata over to Hollidaysburg. Here's where we run into those mountains. What are we doing in Hollidaysburg? In Hollidaysburg, they created a series of inclined planes up and over the mountain. 5 up on one side, 5 down on the other. In 1842, when Charles Dickens toured the U.S., he traveled on the main line. When he went over the Allegheny Portage Railroad, he described it as an engineering marvel. Nothing had ever been done like this, because what was interesting about this, when you got on that canal boat in Columbia, you never got off the canal boat until you got to Pittsburgh. So even when you were being transported over the Allegheny Portage Railroad, you were still in your canal boat. They were sectional canal boats that they put on flat cars to haul over the mountain. They put you back in the water in Johnstown, and from Johnstown, they literally walked you the 104 miles to Pittsburgh. So these are the 4 sections of the main line. So you've got Philadelphia to Columbia Railroad comprises 82 miles. From the Columbia to the Juniata River is, I can't see that there, 172 miles. Over the Allegheny Portage Railroad, which was the Central Division, we have 26 miles, and then Johnstown to Pittsburgh is 104 miles. Yeah.
I'm gonna ask weird.
How fast do you think it took to get across on this system versus the 12 days by Conestoga wagon? Come on, what's your best guess?
30 days.
You're close. 3 days. They could do it in 3 days. It's crazy, right? When you think about how they're doing it, but you could get from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh in 3 days.
In what year?
1834 to 1854. So this was rapid transportation, right? This is 3 days, you know, rapid transportation. But when you think about it, and the other thing I want you to consider is, so this is the main thoroughfare, getting cargo, freight, people across the state of Pennsylvania. Think today, Pennsylvania Turnpike. When you're driving on the turnpike, what is on the turnpike more than anything else?
Tractor trailers.
Tractor trailers. So when you look at the big roads that go across Pennsylvania, Route 80 to a little to the north, or the Pennsylvania Turnpike, the majority of transportation on that is freight. It's 18-wheelers, and you know what? It was the same for the Allegheny Portage Railroad. If you read the old newspaper articles from that time, most of what they're transporting is freight. Iron ore, wool, corn, feed. I mean, it's all freight primarily. Little bit of people, a lot of freight. Here's where that becomes important. The difference in the canal boats when you're hauling freight versus hauling people. When you're hauling people inside those canal boats, and if you go to the Allegheny Portage Railroad in Crescent, they have a little model of one in there. You'll see there are beds, there are kitchen tables, there's like a stove to keep people, you know, keep the people warm, you know. The freight canal boats were truly like 18-wheelers. They were just hollowed out. They were just big freight. There weren't people in them. They became the means by which, when abolitionists stationed along the main line wanted to move freedom seekers along, freight canal boats were the way to go. The other thing too, have any of you ever been to Pittsburgh and done the walk and dam cruise on the Gateway Clipper fleet?
Oh, yeah.
They have a walk and dam cruise where they'll take you down and put you through the Emsworth locks on the ship. If you've ever done that, you'll know that when you're in a lock for a long time. I say a long time, 20, 25 minutes, because they have to lower the water to let you out, and when you're coming the other way, they gotta put you in and they gotta raise the water. Neither of those is fast. So think about now, getting people on and off of freight canal boats while they're in the locks. Locks are going to be very important as we tell this story about how they use this transportation system for the movement of freedom seekers. So now you've got a good idea of how the main line works. So we've got these 4 divisions. So now let's take a trip. Let's start in Philadelphia and we're going to head west. The first person we're going to run across in Philadelphia is William Still. William Still is a very important figure in the study of Underground Railroad, the abolitionist movement. A black man, he works for the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. And Lenwood, I will ask you to jump in here as we move across the state. Any little tidbits you want to throw in, I welcome those as well.
Just wanted to say that it's William Still's daring to write down the information, which is why we're able to reconstruct it, because it was illegal, everything he was doing.
Yes, so remember, keep that in the back of your mind too. You know, dealing with freedom seekers is all against the law. It's all against federal law at this time. You know, they're breaking the law.
Even in Pennsylvania.
Even in Pennsylvania, because it's a federal law, so it covers Pennsylvania as well.
The Gradual Abolition Act is eclipsed by the Fugitive Slave Act, which is a federal law.
Federal dominates the state.
Right, exactly. Now, in 1872, William Still does publish a book called The Underground Railroad, in which he actually documents all of the people who came through his hands in Philadelphia. Now, as a member of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, I wanted to show you on this map, and again, I apologize for the darkness, but here is the terminus of the Philadelphia and Columbia Railroad in Philadelphia, and this dot over here is where the Pennsylvania Abolition Society was located. So really just city blocks away from one another. Keep that in mind too, because remember, we're using the Philadelphia and Columbia Railroad to move people back and forth. So from Philadelphia, we're taking the train out to Columbia. So we use the Philadelphia and Columbia Railroad. Now in Columbia is where we're going to get on our canal boat to head west. In Columbia, we meet William Whipper. William Whipper and his partner, Stephen Smith, he is a very wealthy man in Columbia. He has steamships on Lake Erie. He deals in lumber, he deals in transportation. What we know and how we know that he used canal boats is he writes to William Still, and in this particular letter, he says, "Some I sent west by boats to Pittsburgh and others to you in our cars to Philadelphia." This is proof that they're using the main line of public works as transportation for freedom seekers. The quote about boats west to Pittsburgh, that was huge for us. When we found that was wow. Now we know. Now we know it's true. The cars that he used to send to William Still in Philadelphia had secret compartments in them, specially designed. So when they were transporting people, William Still, he would do this. He would write to Still and tell him, somebody's coming, and they would be ready to receive them at the other end of the line. So what's happening now when they're moving west? And this is what intrigued me, because here's the other thing you need to know about the Underground Railroad. It's hard to research the Underground Railroad because it was a secret. He didn't want anybody to know. So nobody wrote it down. It's really hard to do research. You have to find these little gems to piece together what happened, because nobody is publicly saying this. And we know from research that when you were handing someone off, if she was an abolitionist and she was helping a freedom seeker, she would know you. You would know you, but you wouldn't know her. Because at any given time, if somebody would confront you or arrest you or try and get you to tell, the only person you could give up was her. You couldn't give up anybody else because you didn't know who the entire network was. Actually, the government works very much like that today with intelligence. You only know what you need to know for the next step. You don't know the big picture. So the Underground Railroad worked much the same way. So as I said, to get this little tidbit, what always intrigued me was, who did he know on the next stop west? Like when he's putting these freedom seekers on canal boats and sending them west, he's not doing this willy-nilly. He's not just putting them on that canal boat and hoping, fingers crossed, they get to safety. There had to be somebody that he was in contact with at that next stop, but we don't today know who that is yet. Go ahead, ask.
Who found this information and when?
Well,
This was found by a man by the name of Charles Bloxton. And Charles Bloxton actually is an African-American physicist, but he got so interested in collecting documents and collected so many documents that he created the Bloxton Museum, which is now at Temple University. And it was the students of 2 or 3 decades who followed Mr. Bloxton's research that dug up all these news clippings and letters and fragments. It's like paleontology.
Exactly. They're little bits of pieces that you have to connect to make sense. And it's funny, and I know Lenwood would agree with me, the funny thing is with researching in this area, you will read something today and it will mean nothing to you. 6 months later, you will find something else and go, oh, now I knew what they meant, and then it all makes sense. Then it fits together. Sometimes they're just odd by themselves, but this was big for us in determining how the main line was used. So for Columbia, our next stop up the Susquehanna.
Could I say just
yes, go jump in.
one quick thing before we leave Mr. Whipper and Mr. Smith? They were so wealthy that they financed the bridge between Columbia, which is Lancaster County, and York County. They paid for and built that bridge. They also blew that bridge up in July of 1863 when the Confederates were in York and about to cross over into Lancaster County, and they gave the word to blow the bridge up. It took 20 more years for commerce to recover because of the lack of the freight being able to move between them. So it was a great sacrifice, in say, county.
I have a question.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
So, you may have said it, are the operators aware of the freedom seekers being on the canal boat?
Oh, yeah,
On
they
the-
would have known.
Right, so
Yeah.
they're part of that.
That's right. They're
right.
not just being put on haphazardly and we just hope for better things. There will be someone who will receive them at whatever designated point they're to be received and will help them further north.
And hide on the boats.
Pardon me?
And they have to hide on the boat.
Yes. And then here's what's interesting. So recently, 10 years ago, I was at the museum, the Genealogy and Historical Society of Blair County Museum, and they said to us, hey, we have the lock keeper's logbook from Hollidaysburg. So we started looking through it, and I took pictures of pages I thought were interesting. Here we find out it actually has a record. Now this is in November, which is weird because that's almost at the end of the transportation cycle for the main line. And why do you think November's getting near the end? Winter. It's hard to keep water in canals in Pennsylvania in the winter. So November's getting near the end of the cycle, but in this log tender's book, there were excerpts going to William Still in Philadelphia of woolen bundles of wool. So I actually, when I saw this, I thought this is weird to me for some reason. I contacted a sheep guy in the area, in Center County. I says, when do you shear your sheep and ship the wool? He says, we do that in the spring. I says, well, would sending wool in November be odd? He says, well, look at it this way. If you're storing it and you're gonna ship it later, you could, but he says, it's not usual. He says, we get rid of it. We shear them in the spring, we ship the wool off. So the fact that they're sending wool in November to William Still in Philadelphia, to me, that's a sign. You know, that they've got a runaway or a freedom seeker somewhere that they're transporting.
So it was code.
So,
It was code.
so after the Civil War, was it still dangerous to talk about what you did on the
No, it
underground?
wasn't, but there was no need to at that point too, after
So
the war
nobody-
is over.
Actually, I'm trying to make this succinct. Just because you pass legislation doesn't mean that people are going to act on it. You know, if you don't have someone administering and conducting that legislation. So it's like Juneteenth. Just because Granger showed up in Texas and said, oh, all your enslaved people are free now, didn't mean that the Confederates in Texas freed those people. It was June, the fields were, they had to fight until December for those people to be free. And the people with bounties on their heads, those bounties were not resolved until 1870.
Oh.
So if you had broken the law, you could still technically be returned for the value of your fine.
So as we go up the Susquehanna, our next stop is going to be in Harrisburg at Turner's Alley. Now Turner's Alley was, in essence, in Philadelphia, the Black District. It was where the largest black population was, freed blacks. I'm really sorry about it. You know, I would have brought a screen that you could have seen this.
You know what, we talked about that, and I was gonna get a bigger screen, and then, these were lent to us, and I'm like, I'm not sure if that's gonna be the right size, I'm sorry.
That's okay. I'm just sorry you're not seeing these
Seeing
pictures.
pictures, yeah.
So this is one of the Pennsylvania historic markers that designates Tanner's Alley and talks about the fact that this was part of, used by abolitionists, and abolitionists were active in Tanner's Alley. Again, this is a map you probably can't see, but Tanner's Alley is right here on this map of Philadelphia, of Harrisburg. This is the state capitol right here. So if you have ever gone to Harrisburg and stood on the steps of the Capitol facing the Susquehanna River, which is here, there is a long vista there that, you know, gives you a beautiful view out to the river. That was Tanner's Alley. They eradicated all of that to put that vista in. And this blue line here shows where the canal was. So the canal was very close to Tanner's Alley. So if you had freedom seekers that you could get off a boat, because again, these aren't fast-moving boats. You know, we're walking along a tow line, you know, canal boat tow path here. You could get them off and assimilate them into the nearest black community, which in Harrisburg would have been Tanner's Alley. As we go up the Susquehanna, our next stop is going to be where we're crossing over at Clark's Ferry, and we're picking up the Juniata River. So just a little north of Harrisburg, here's Clark's Ferry. This is where the canal is going to cross over a canal bridge. And the canal bridges are really interesting too, engineering-wise, because they were bridges that held water. So they're canal bridges. They're filled with water. You crossed the Susquehanna, and then you picked up the Juniata. So this is going to be your leg now to come into Hollidaysburg. When we get to Hollidaysburg, and this is they have actually recreated the lock in Hollidaysburg, so you can go down to Canal Park. This was the superintendent's home who ran this particular canal walk, and you can actually see what the canal walk looked like in Hollidaysburg. In 1855, we have a huge incident take place here. It's called the Parsons and Green incident. And this is the amazing story. And we got this actually on the National Network to Freedom, which is a network developed by the National Park Service to identify sites, people, things related to Underground Railroad activity. So in 1855, Jacob Green escapes from his home in, I just lost the name of the town, in Virginia. It'll come to me. He makes it up to Hollidaysburg. He was owned by a gentleman, Parsons, who was a state representative for the state of Virginia. So when he finds out that Green has escaped, he sends his nephew, Jim, up to find him. So Jim brings a couple of guys, they follow him up to Pennsylvania. Jim stays in Hollidaysburg, two other guys go over to Johnstown. They're monitoring the Allegheny Portage Railroad to see if he gets away. Green gets on a canal boat in Hollidaysburg, buys a ticket, gets on, because remember, in Pennsylvania, blacks are free. He could buy a ticket, and he does. He buys a ticket, he gets on the canal boat. Doesn't Jim Parsons do the same thing? He buys a ticket and gets on the same canal boat. He recognizes him and hollers to him, "Jacob Green!" Jacob panics. He jumps off the canal boat. Now here's what's neat in Hollidaysburg. On one side of the canal is Gaysport, which is the black community. On the other side is Hollidaysburg. Jacob Green jumps off the canal boat into Gaysport. All these black residents come on, so this big melee occurs, right? So Parsons is trying to get him back, and the sheriff comes out and says, "Okay, what's going on?" Parsons shows an arrest warrant for Jacob Green. This is where it gets interesting. The sheriff looks at us and says, "Well, isn't this nice? Unfortunately, this is made in Virginia. We are not going to recognize this in Pennsylvania. You need to get this reissued in the state of Pennsylvania in order to take him. If you take him without a warrant from Pennsylvania, you're basically kidnapping him." Jim Parsons, he is like furious, right? He ends up getting arrested and put in the Hollidaysburg jail because he's causing such a ruckus. The black community in Gaysport gets Jacob Green away. So he calls his uncle in Virginia and says, I'm in jail in Hollidaysburg. The uncle is furious. He calls the governor of Virginia and says, you better get my nephew out of jail in Pennsylvania, like right now. He sends up the Virginia Attorney General. They're like, well, you know, he came up here, he didn't have a valid warrant for his arrest, you know, he's causing us trouble, we arrested him. So the Attorney General goes back to Parsons in Virginia and says, well, you know, they've got him dead to rights, it was attempted kidnapping. Parsons has the governor of Virginia send a letter to the governor of Pennsylvania saying, if you do not release my nephew, I am sending the Virginia militia up to get him. To which Pennsylvania replies, bring it on, we have a militia too. So really, I mean, when you think about this in 1855, the Civil War could have started in Hollidaysburg. Okay? So finally a judge in Blair County, calmer heads prevail. They release Parsons back to the Attorney General and say, just take him back to Virginia and don't come back into Pennsylvania again. We find out later in looking in Jacob Green's background, Jacob Green was like our Harriet Tubman. He came back and forth across the Pennsylvania line numerous times, bringing freedom seekers into Pennsylvania. So he was not new to this at all. The getting caught in this incident was new for him. But this was like a big deal in Hollidaysburg, that he was actually on a canal boat, ready to head west, and he got caught. So that's our story in Hollidaysburg. So now we're going to traverse the Allegheny Portage Railroad. So it's a series of, we have a little map here that shows 5 inclined planes up to the summit at the Lemon House, which is the Allegheny Portage Railroad National Historic Site today. And then 5 inclines down into the canal basin in Johnstown. When you're at the summit, when you're up at the Lemon House, you need to know also that there was a small black community up there that lived and serviced the mainline canal, the Allegheny Portage Railroad. They were iron workers, they were blacksmiths, they helped shod the horses, they took care of the engines. So there was an entire little black community up there that when the mainline canal was no longer in existence, they disappeared, they moved out of the area. But there was a black community up at the top of the summit as well.
We're in Johnstown. Oh, sorry.
So now we get to Johnstown. So now we come into the canal basin in Johnstown. If you're familiar with Johnstown at all, over past the Gautier Wire Works, there used to be Hyde Electric over there, and there used to be, it was the terminal for the old Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. That was the canal basin. They filled it all in. So that's where the canal basin was in Johnstown, where they would come in. Now when we get to Johnstown, we have a whole host of Underground Railroad agents in Johnstown. And I will read you these names. We have James Heslop and his wife. James is a canal boat painter. He paints the names on the canal boats. We have William and John Cushion, their brothers, who own land right above the canal basin. William Slick, who is a local magistrate, and we're going to talk about him in a minute, and his son Benjamin. We have Wallace Fortune, who is a black minister. So in 1854 in Johnstown, there is an African church, and he is the minister. He and another famous Johnstown person, Samuel Williams, who eventually leads the Liberian movement to return, if blacks wanted to go back to Africa, to Liberia. Wallace Fortune ministers to all the black community to work the canal. We have Henry Willis, who is an actual Allegheny Portage Railroad superintendent. He is an abolitionist. And most importantly, we have Daniel Morrell, who is the superintendent of the Cambria Iron Works. Daniel Morrell is a Quaker who came from Philadelphia. He is very anti-slavery. And actually, Daniel Morrell uses his influence 2 times for the workers at Cambria Iron. Once in 1860, where he pretty much tells them all, you will vote for Abraham Lincoln or you won't have a job here on Monday. And Cambria County, when you look at the election for Abraham Lincoln, Cambria County puts Lincoln over the top in balloting for Pennsylvania. The second time was when the Civil War breaks out, and Daniel Morrell, if you had a job in the steel industry there, if you were working for Cambria Iron, and you had a job that your wife could do while you went off and served, she could hold your job for you while you were gone. But he guaranteed anyone who served in the Civil War, he provided for the family while you were away you were serving. So he was very foresight-seeing as far as making sure everything went his way. But anyway, let's talk about what happens in Johnstown, where all these other players come into play. 1837, now remember the Portage Railroad is 34 to 54, so this is 1837, the Patrick and Abraham incident. This is also an incident that has been recorded on the National Network to Freedom. You can't see this map, but Patrick and Abraham are brothers. They're owned by Colonel Sherrard in Bath, Virginia. Today it's Berkeley Springs, West Virginia, but it was Bath, Virginia at the time. They escaped. They used the Warrior's Path, the Indian Trail, that cuts just this side of the mountain ridge. They end up in St. Clair, Bedford County. Then they're taken by abolitionists and brought over the mountain to Johnstown. Bounty hunters follow them, and at the mountain, it was so funny when we were researching this, they kept talking about on the mountaintop, the household property on the mountaintop. We found the household property, and it's really just off of Elton Road in Richland. But for them, that was the top of the mountain. Because William Slick is the magistrate in the Geisttown area at this time. So when the bounty hunters catch up to Patrick and Abraham, one shoots one in the leg, shoots the other one in the back. They manage to escape. They make it to the home of William Slick. He sees them bloody when they knock on the door, and his first question to them is, "Did you kill someone?" They said, "No, we were shot." Then the bounty hunters show up, and again, here we have this little technicality. They've got an arrest warrant from the state of Virginia that Slick says, "We're not going to honor it. You have to get that warrant reissued in Pennsylvania. In the meantime, we're going to take these guys downtown and give them aid because they're both wounded." So they take them down to Johnstown and they put them up where all of a sudden all those people on that list show up. The Cushons show up, Benjamin Slick, the son of William Slick, they show up. Anyway, long story short, they go to the Cambria County judge, they get the warrant reissued for their arrest. When they go to get Patrick and Abraham, they're gone. They're not there. We don't know what happened to them to this day. I'm still looking to see what happened to them. But what we think happened to them is, in Johnstown, here's the canal basin, like I said, where the hydroelectric was. This is present-day Frankstown Road. Right at the top of Frankstown Road, Benjamin Slick owned a big piece of property, and right next to it, in this area, was where the Cushons, John and William Cushon, owned a coal mine, or like a coal bank. We know that they hid freedom seekers there, and this is where they put Patrick and Abraham. So they brought them from downtown Johnstown up this way to the house of Ben Slick, who then put them in the coal bank here. And they kept them there until they got them to freedom. I still think they were in the area, and I'm going to find that someday, but this was the big incident in 1837. This went to the Cambria County Court. You can see there was a grand jury convened. All the abolitionists in Johnstown were called to testify before the grand jury. Because Patrick and Abraham had escaped by this time, they declared a no true bill, and they said there's no court case. Produce the freedom seekers, produce the runaways. Where are they? This is well, they got away, and this is well, then you have no case. And they dismissed the whole case. So the bounty hunters had to go back to John Sherrard in Virginia, say they got away. So this was our big case in Johnstown.
Do you know the judge's name?
Oh, that's a good question. I have the paperwork. No, I don't, but I can tell you that. I'll give you my business card, you email me, and I will tell you who that judge was. So now we're going to head to Pittsburgh. And from Pittsburgh, we're going to hit a couple of mile markers along the way. So going down to Pittsburgh, we're going to hit Blairsville, Salzburg is the big one, and then we're going to end up in Pittsburgh. So let's stop here in Blairsville Underground Railroad Museum. You are sorely missing out. It is amazing. And a good friend of mine, Denise Jenkins Doyle, she has identified over 90 abolitionists in Indiana County and has them all documented. It's incredible. The one I wanted to talk about today was Mr. Graff. He lived in Blairsville. What was interesting about him was He actually had tunnels underneath his barn where he would, and he was a merchant, so he had canals on the canal where he would ship back and forth to Johnstown, he would ship from Blairsville to Pittsburgh, so he had his own canal line, kind of like his own trucking firm. He had his own canal line, and again, his home was located right across from where a lock was. So again, if there's an opportunity to get people off and on those canal boats, when those canal boats are in those locks being moved up and down, that is the time to do it. There is a wonderful walking tour in Blairsville that points out all of the spots connected to John Graff. His home is no longer there, nor is the barn, but they have documented all this, and another 90 plus abolitionists now in Indiana County. So by all means, go to Blairsville to their Underground Railroad Museum. From Blairsville, we go to Salzburg. Now this is, you gotta take this story with a grain of salt, and I'll tell you why. So to prove my theory that they're really using the main line, you know, to get them all the way to Pittsburgh, Salzburg's the next big town. I looked through all the Indiana County histories. I tried to get into the Salzburg Museum. They were like never open. I was reading newspaper articles. Finally, because I'm a librarian by trade and I am like a dog with a bone with research, right? You know, I've got to find it. I posted to a Underground Railroad listserv. Does anybody know of anything that ever happened in Salzburg with Underground Railroad? Didn't I get results back? And one woman told me, she says, I grew up in Salzburg and we always heard about the Underground Railroad there. There's a hotel in town that's supposedly haunted by a runaway who was, the bounty hunter caught up with her and killed her while she was being hidden in this hotel. She's supposed to haunt the place. But the woman said, but the Underground Railroad is really obvious in Salzburg. It's right on the main street. You can see the tunnel right on the main street. So I looked at that and I thought, there's a tunnel right on the main street of Salzburg. I hadn't been to Salzburg. I never saw that. So I called the borough office. Don't ever call the borough office. They didn't know anything. Like, they didn't know anything. I'm like, there's a tunnel right on the main drag in Salzburg. And they're like, what? Okay. When I was researching Patrick and Abraham, and I was down in Bath, Virginia, I went into the courthouse to ask for records from 1837 when you were Virginia. And the young girls at the desk were like, what? We're like West Virginia. You were West Virginia in 1863. Before that, you were Virginia. They had like no clue. So then they find this woman in the back who literally was there during the Civil War. And she came forward and she's like, yeah, we were Virginia. I know about that. So don't ever trust public officials to know what's going on. So I went there, and I'm driving through Salzburg real slow. I'm looking. I'm sure they're thinking, who is this person? Why are they driving real slow? But sure enough, there was the house, and there was the, again, you can't see this, but there was a piece of plexiglass in the middle of a sidewalk covering up a tunnel. So of course I get out of the car, park the car, and right behind this house is lock number 8. It's right behind this house is the lock. So I got on, and the plexiglass was real muddy and dirty. I couldn't see anything. So of course, what did I do? I just pulled it up because I thought, well, you know, nobody knows it's here, so they're not going to know if it's damaged or not. I lifted it up so I could stick my hand in and actually take pictures of the tunnel that was on the main street. Now, is this true? I don't know, but we know there was the marshals who were very prominent in Salzburg. They were very staunch abolitionists. They lived in town not far from this location. It's supposition at this point, but I cannot believe that there was not activity in. So when we leave Salzburg, we're going to finally come into Pittsburgh. Now, when we get to Pittsburgh, we come across the Allegheny River. This is a painting again, you can't see it, but there's a canal bridge that goes over the Allegheny River, and it comes into Pittsburgh on the north side. So this dotted line shows where the canal came into Pittsburgh and terminated. This is PNC Park right here, to give you some idea of where that is. And you can't see it on this map, but right about here is Allegheny Center Mall, the old Allegheny Center Mall. That's important because in the 1950s, they discovered, before they built Allegheny Center Mall, the Avery AME Church was here. They found when they tore the church down a tunnel that ran from under the AME church, and I have it here on a map. It ran from under the AME church right down to where the lock was. Now, I'm backing up because when they were building PNC Park and they were doing excavations, they actually found the lock. So they excavated this lock, and all the pieces of this lock are, the University of Pittsburgh has them, and they're in a facility at their Harmerville site. But they have all the remnants of this lock. And here is, you can't see this, but here's a picture of a gentleman from the Heinz History Center standing in the tunnel that went up underneath this AME church. So there was an actual tunnel that went right up to this church. Now, in Pittsburgh, wow, we have a lot of people of importance in Pittsburgh. And you could do an entire presentation on any one of these people because they're all amazing. Reverend Charles Avery, he is on the north side in the city of Manchester at that time. He builds a school, he builds a church. Avery Street is named after him. Again, abolitionist, dedicated to the cause, helps blacks who live in the Pittsburgh area. And remember, at this time, there's 3 different cities in Pittsburgh. The south side is the city of Birmingham. The city of Pittsburgh is just the piece in the middle between the 2 rivers. And then the north side is Birmingham. So Charles, pardon me?
Allegheny, Birmingham, and Pittsburgh.
Allegheny, well, Birmingham, yes, Birmingham, Pittsburgh, Allegheny, yes. He's on the north side. Then we have John Vashon. Again, this is a free black. He runs city baths. He is part of the, I just lost the name of it, the Western Pennsylvania Abolition Society. He is a member of that and does a lot of work with them. This is his son-in-law, John Boyer Vashon, and his wife. The other big names here are
Before the Vashons, the Vashons are the folks I talked to earlier about who were wig makers and prostheses, and they would redress in freedom seekers and camouflage them through men dresses women, women dresses men, complexion, those things, and so you escape in disguise. So the Underground Railroad is not always someone in a tunnel or underground. It might be the person sitting next to you on the train. But Vashon was great in disguises, and he goes down and wins Steele's book for stealing people into plain sight.
The other big name here is Martin Delaney. Martin Delaney, he was born into, his mother was a slave in Virginia. He spent time in Chambersburg. When he was in Johnstown on his way to Pittsburgh, his mother actually dies when they live in Johnstown. He ends up in Pittsburgh. He produces a newsletter called The Mystery. Unfortunately, I believe there's only 1 or 2 pages of it that exist today. The newspaper doesn't exist. He was a major in the Civil War, one of the only black majors in the Civil War, commissioned directly by Abraham Lincoln.
May I add that the reason why the mystery doesn't exist today is that he sells the mystery to Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison, who produce it under another name, and then they sell it to the AME Church as the Christian Recorder, and the Christian Recorder is still produced today. It's the longest continuous African American newspaper in the United States.
So Martin Delaney, big one, and then Jane Grace Swiss Elm. There's actually a neighborhood in the east part of Pittsburgh called Swiss Elm. That's where she lived. Here's her interesting story. You remember in the 1830s, there was when they were deciding on getting the Missouri Compromise, getting in 1820, trying to decide what to do with the states that were coming on in the West. Preston Brooks beats Charles Sumner, who's a representative from Massachusetts, beats him on the floor of the U.S. House. Beats him. Man was pretty good. Sumner recuperates in Crescent, at the Mountain House in Crescent. Interesting, right? Jane Swisshelm takes a train out to meet with him to discuss, what's going on with abolitionism and, anti-slavery sentiments. Robert Johnston, the doctor from Blairsville, is who attends Charles Sumner, and he is on the list of abolitionists in Blairsville. So it's very interesting that of all the places in the United States that Charles Sumner could have gone to recuperate from his beating, he chooses Crescent, Pennsylvania. And there are letters that he writes from Crescent on Crescent Mountain House letterhead. But Jane Swisshelm goes out and meets with him to discuss next steps in pushing emancipation forward. So why are all these people in Pittsburgh too? Why is this so important? Why is Pittsburgh such a hub? Because just a little bit away from Pittsburgh in Wheeling, Virginia, now remember it's still Virginia at this time, Wheeling, Virginia, you have a huge slave market. The buying and selling of people are happening in Wheeling. If they can escape from the slave market, they only have to get to Pittsburgh, to the arms of all those abolitionists who will be more than willing to help them. But, as Lenwood said about the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, you could also go into Pittsburgh and capture black people and take them to the slave market to be sold.
What was interesting about the slide before, if you could go back to this slide before. So, earlier we talked about the difference between freedmen and freemen. Freedmen were people who had experienced the institution of slavery within their lifetime, that had been freed through one of the vehicles of manumission, coartation, or emancipation. Freemen were the children of freedmen who were born free and had never experienced the institution of enslavement. And freemen of color, FPC, means that neither of the parent nor the grandparent had ever been enslaved in their lifetime. So in the census, we see freedmen, freemen, and FPC, freemen of color. It's the generations. These were wealthy people by the time this story begins. They could have taken their wealth and gone to Canada and said, that's it, or Paris, or Italy. But they used their wealth for the emancipation and the citizenship. And they changed their minds a lot of times. This guy, at first, he felt at first, we can't stay here. We'll never be. Remember what I was saying about you could be free, but you can't be a citizen? He started out saying, let's go back to Africa. In fact, he sat down with Abraham Lincoln, who offered him $500,000, which was a huge amount of money then, to buy votes. If I free these people, will you take them all back to Africa? Because I don't know what to do with them here. The question of what if Lincoln lived? What was his next move? Has not been answered. He changed his mind about going back to Africa, but not before establishing places like Liberia and Monrovia and Senegal. And he chose to come back and have African Americans fight in the Civil War to prove their citizenship. And thus 180,000 freedmen fought for the Union Army as the United States colored troops. And some of them went on to Canada and started colonies and establishments. Others started colleges. But this is a pantheon of African American intelligence. Some of them are the children of mixed race. We talked about how that came to be. Not every plantation master is the reason why there is a mixed-race child. Some of them went on to have lineages, like the Vashon family, that started girls' schools and hospitals. And so these names, I always get excited when Barbara shows this, because this is like the talented 10th.
Yeah, this is
You
the
know,
who's
like,
who.
yeah.
Well, it's funny when he talks about the Liberian movement and Martin Delaney being involved in that, because in Johnstown, it was Samuel Williams in Johnstown who started, and he and Nesbitt from Blair County went over to Liberia. And what triggered Sam Williams to do it was he could vote up until 1838, and then the state legislature changed the Constitution that took his right to vote away. And he was so confused by that. He writes in the beginning of his book about his experience in Liberia. His opening statement is, "I didn't recognize this country anymore, that they would take my vote away from me. I voted up until this time." He says, "Now I'm not a citizen anymore." He said, "I'm leaving." And he picked up his family and they went to Liberia. The Nesbitts in Blair County, they went as well. And then what brought Samuel Williams back was the Nesbitts came back and they wrote this scathing book about Liberia that was horrible, it was terrible, blah, blah, blah. Samuel Williams got a copy of it and was so incensed by it, he came back to write his 4 years in Liberia story and discount everything that Nesbitt said.
But let me say that again, because it's so important. African American men who owned land in Pennsylvania could vote until 1838, when the Constitution of Pennsylvania was changed and they lost the vote. It took them to 1870, the 15th Amendment, to recover the right to vote. So these people were not working for freedom. They were working for citizenship. They were working for the right to serve on juries, to vote, to be represented. And it's the difference between the conversation about freeing a person and the conversation about the fulfillment of citizenship. And we're still struggling with that tonight on the news.
So what would you say when he wrote about his 4 years, about how horrible it was, and 4 years how good it was? Which one was true?
Well, I guess that depends on your perspective. I mean, Samuel Williams, he left family over there, and I've reached out to some of the librarians over in Liberia to find out what they have in their archives that talk to that, but who knows? I mean, one had a bad experience, one had a good experience. Samuel Williams really believed in the cause. He really believed that there was no place in the United States for black people anymore because of the way it was moving, and he felt Liberia was really the answer to that. So who knows what the truth is? I mean, Liberia exists today. It's still
But
there.
the truth, brother, is that these people have lived in America for 150 years. They were from Africa, but not of Africa. They could not go back anymore.
Then if you have a German heritage, I could send you back to Germany today. And you would
Right, after
feel it.
3 generations. My people, where are you from? I'm from the place of my people. My origins are here. My history is here. My sweat equity is here. My language is here. So when these people were transported back to Africa, Africans in Senegal, in Liberia, said, "We don't know who you are. You're not, you're not us. You're from us, but you are a different people." And they found it extreme. They found that they had acclimated to a Western culture, that they needed to go back home to find how and where to fit in. I'm sorry, I'm taking your time, Barbara.
No, that's okay, please.
So let me say
Almost
this.
done.
African Americans were born in the middle of the ocean, in the middle of the Middle Passage. They were forged like steel is not iron. They were forged out of an experience and injected into a place where they are still in the process. We are still in the process of becoming. You know, we are in, but not of. You know, and we are covered by an act. Acts expire like your milk do. Acts expire like the freshness on the side of the carton. You know, the right to vote is an act. The right for citizenship is an act. And so the African American is a phenomenon that is not connected to place, but experience in that place. Still struggling for the 40 acres and the mule, you know, some piece. That is why ownership is so important in African American communities. The way we measure people is by their relationship to the earth, to the thing they own. And so this question of what if Abraham Lincoln had lived? What do you do with 5 million people that you have successfully freed, but you do not necessarily want to absorb into the fabric of your country? And so we keep trying to fix that. You know, we keep trying to plaster up the crack of what to do with African American in America at the same time that a community is saying, how many ways do I have to prove that I belong? But the question is the 2 documents. One is Declaration of Independence, and the other is the Constitution. The Declaration of Independence is a romantic document. You know, it's a proclamation. It's an ideal. It's a thing that we want to achieve. The Constitution is a contract of who's in and who's not. And the Constitution says I'm 3/5. The Constitution, you know, is structured on my value as property. The Constitution, except for its 13th, 14th, 15th, and 19th Amendment, is really a document of compromise. In order to make a more perfect union, this is what we came up with. You know, this is not it. You know, like this, we still are trying to figure out what to do with this third group of people. And that's why these people on this screen had solved the issue of freedom. Now they were dealing with the issue of citizenship, you know, and how do we belong? How do we become?
And someone who had, and this is what we're going to end with on here, someone who was really an advocate for that question was Thaddeus Stevens. I mean, you've all heard of Thaddeus Stevens. He was an attorney, an iron first, a newspaper publisher. This one's important. He was a Pennsylvania Canal Commissioner. So during the Pennsylvania Main Line, we know that he actually positioned at strategic points along the main line canal sub-commissioners, you know, superintendents in different parts of the main line that shared his belief in abolitionist views as well. And then, of course, a radical Republican U.S. congressman. But he tried to address issues very much that Lenwood is stating as far as citizenship, belonging. This was his.
And there will be 9 stories tonight that we don't think about as Thaddeus Stevens stories that are in the news tonight. We are talking about the 14th Amendment, which is one of the 13th and 14th Amendment and the draft of the 15th Amendment are Thaddeus Stevens' contributions. But tonight we will discuss abortion under the 14th Amendment right. We will talk about the right to citizenship and voting and fair under the 14th Amendment right. We'll talk about, can Mr. Trump run for office if he's a fugitive under the 14th Amendment right? And so Thaddeus' 14th Amendment and his 15th Amendment with the right to vote and the access to the vote, these are like what I refer to as divine acts of legislation, because they're evergreen. They still protect us, they still cover us, and they're still the root discussions about so many things that are on the nightly news. Thaddeus is a remarkable person. He was denigrated because he had what we believe to be a common law experience with Lydia Hamilton Smith, a free woman of color, and D.W. Griffith, and his films made Thaddeus a demonized Thaddeus in a way, but Thaddeus in 1832 is the reason for the Pennsylvania Public Education Act. You know, that so much of what we consider to be basic rights came out of this Pennsylvania gift to the United States.
There's a school here.
Yes, there is the Thaddeus
It's
Stevens
your
School.
hall now.
So what you need to understand from what everything Lenwood and I have told you today is that the old adage is true. Those who don't study and understand history are doomed to repeat it.
Yes.
You know, so I think we see that more and more every day. The other thing too to take away from this, which I always try and leave people who I present to, is what makes this story about the main line and connections to Underground Railroad is so amazing to me is you were using a publicly funded, state-funded transportation system to violate federal law. And there's something really interesting in that to me, you know, that's how important this issue was for people in Pennsylvania to do what needed to be done, because, and remember, Pennsylvania, if you understand its background, started by Quakers, you know, abolished slavery in 1787, so had gradual manumission. Big story to tell here in Pennsylvania. So does anyone else have any questions or comments or things you'd like to discuss with Lenwood or I?
We often look for places, tunnels, barns, tracks, you know, but this is really about people. This is about a network of people who are committed, you know, to bringing each one teach one, each one bring one back into the sun, you know, saving the vision of America. And so that there are no little people in the Underground Railroad movement, because each person did. Last thing is, Desmond Tutu says, do your little part every day. It's the little parts that put the puzzle together, you know, that make up the victory. And so I say each of us are agents or conductors or safe houses, you know, on the Underground Railroad for common ground, for common experience, for common belief in equity, justice, and when we sing the battle hymn of the Republic, when we sing the national anthem, The national anthem is structured as a 19th century lyceum. The lyceum structure is, you pose a question, you give two examples that support your question, and you leave your audience with a greater rhetorical question. So, oh, say, does that Star-Spangled Banner still wave, or the land of the free and the home of the brave? That's the real question. You know, we get caught up in the rocket's red glare, you know, and the singer's voice going up, and, you know, in the top, you know, up over the top. We get caught up in all the histrionics of the song, you know. But the real purpose of the song is the final line. Do we still believe in what we believe in? You know, and if we do, what can we do about it? You know, that question doesn't have a party. That question has a purpose. These people were still believers, and they put their lives on the line. Many people were arrested. We could give you a whole 2-day course in the white, black, and others who were put in jail for helping along this line. So you'll find when you go to the Underground Railroad that somebody will say to you, something important used to be here, but it's not here anymore. You know, you say, well, what do I do with that? You know, you stand on this place that was holy ground. You know, you stand on that place and you remember. So it's more about the remembering, you know, than the rebuilding. We can't build the thing that was supposed to be invisible.
Well, and exactly, that's the problem we ran into in Johnstown when we were doing our Network to Freedom designation. I had written the application and they wanted to know where we were gonna put the marker. Well, thanks to the 1889 flood, none of those buildings associated with Patrick and Abraham were there anymore. The only place we could put the marker was Sandyvale Cemetery, where we could document that the abolitionists were buried, because everything else was gone. So there's no tours in Johnstown of Underground Railroad stories, because the floods took care of all that. They erased all that.
So it's really about the people of every. It's about the church. It's about the songs that were sung, like "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot," which was written by an African American man, which is really about getting on the Underground Railroads. I looked over Jordan, and what did I see? Coming forth to carry me home. The band of angels is the canal boat, or the carriage, or the wade in the water. Wade in the water, children, wade in the water. It's about walking in the water so that you don't leave footprints.
And scent. Your scent.
For the so embedded in our churches, embedded in our thought, embedded in our language, are all these terms that were like fine needlework in the fabric of Americans' hopes and dreams. And I love the places, but I love the people more. You know, the stories of the people. Adopt one. That's what you can do for us. You know, adopt any one of them. You know, and follow their stories. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Yes.